Hello English students, and welcome to another video in the Paris and 5 Minutes series. These are videos focused on the AQA Language and Literature Paris Anthology for A-level study, and in this text we will be looking at On Paris by Ernest Hemingway. So without further ado, let's get going. In summary, this is a column written by Hemingway, who is living in Paris, back to a newspaper in Toronto, and his column is attacking people who he sees as wannabes and fakers who have flocked to Paris during Prohibition. There are three excerpts, there are three articles in this extract, and the first is American Bohemians in Paris, in which he's attacking superficial characters who are posing as artists in the Café Rotonde. In the second extract, Wild Night of Music in Paris, he is describing a kind of artificial and inflated version of Paris that is presented to exploit rich Americans, and he then describes in a little dramatic vignette a tourist who strays into the real gritty Parisian underworld and receives a vicious mugging. Finally, in the Mecca of Fakers, Hemingway reflects on the number of fakers who are attracted to Paris, where they can safely exaggerate their fame back across the Atlantic, and he cites examples of overhyped boxers and celebrities, but particularly boxers who are exposed in the ring. If you don't know the context on Hemingway, it's a really useful one to know. He is one of the great 20th century writers. He is renowned for what it can be described as a very masculine writing style, which we can probably see traces of certainly in this extract, and that he's writing in Paris at a time where Paris is very much the centre of the world's literary scene, and it's worth remembering that these guys are the rock stars of their age, and what they are getting up to is of great global interest. So in the context for this text, we can obviously understand that it is a written text, and it features only the written mode of communication, and in terms of its genre, it is really a gossip or society column. It is being published in a newspaper, but it's not obviously hard-hitting news or journalism. It is, however, related to current affairs and comment. People obviously over in Toronto, on the other side of the Atlantic, are obviously very interested in the social scene in Paris. They're also probably interested in Hemingway because he's an established author and literary figure at this point. In terms of its purpose is mostly to entertain. I guess people read these kinds of society columns because they find them entertaining and engaging, but also to inform them because they're interested in lifestyle and in what lifestyle is like in Paris. With regard to the kinds of readers, we have got here, Hemingway is writing most likely for readers with sort of literary and cultural interests, and readers with a global outlook. So possibly people who have been to Paris, people who understand the literary circles in which he is moving. With regard to subjects, it covers a range of subjects that are found elsewhere in the anthology. Society, tourism, crime is a strong representation, as are lifestyle, and of course people watching. So to look in a little more detail at the kinds of representations that Hemingway is offering, the extracts are mostly representing the behaviour of foreign visitors to Paris, and that's Hemingway's focus really, rather than the city itself. And Hemingway is offering us a satire. He is satirising the behaviours and attitudes of visitors to Paris, and he does that really through creating kind of grotesque exaggerations of them. So they are really caricatures, and he also offers us dramatic situations, his little dramatic anecdote, the mugging. So it's a satire, and it's important to understand that readers would understand that really Hemingway is exaggerating here for effect. Hemingway's representation of the Parisian muggers, ironically, is probably more favourable than his representation of the tourists. And we can argue really, having read that second text, that the former, the muggers, they are quite authentic, and the latter, the tourists, they are presented as shallow. Hemingway, as we commented earlier, has a masculine writing style and a very casual attitude to violence, and I think that's borne out in this text. Hemingway's self-representation as an artist is heavily implied in his description of these fakes and frauds that he sees at work, and obviously he is probably trying to convey his status as a much more authentic artist, one who really understands artistic production and artistic devotion. The representations of Paris are really divided, and there's a kind of an essential contrast in all of these texts between the fake and the real. So we have this sanitized, artificial, overinflated Paris that is presented to tourists, and then this real underbelly which Hemingway obviously feels he can see and understand and can convey to the reader. And that contrast between the fake and the real is present in every single text. You have the fake boxers getting found out against the real boxers. You have the fake wannabe artists being compared to the real artists. In terms of the linguistic features, Hemingway obviously is a literary writer, and so this text has mostly a fairly high literary register and some really effective devices which are great for analysis. To begin with, especially in the opening to the first text, there is a number of figurative and fairly literary devices used. He has an extended aquatic metaphor which is really quite engaging, describing the people coming across the Atlantic as scum. They are skimmed from the top of the ocean, they are ladled onto Paris, and they are forming levees, and a levee is like a kind of a tide, if you like, or a barrier formed of scum. Obviously, these people have travelled across the Atlantic to be in Paris, so this is quite a well-chosen metaphor. He's reinforcing that metaphor through these triadic structures, or through this use of a triplet of pre-modifying superlative adjectives. They are the oldest, the thickest, and the scummiest scum. He also then continues using this kind of animalistic metaphor to describe the people in the rotonde. It's a birdhouse, and these are guests who are squawking. Finally, on that first page, we have this rhetorical comparison to eating a jug of soured molasses. Now, I'm not entirely sure what soured molasses are, but I know molasses is kind of like a sort of treacle, so I'm trying to imagine something that's as thick as treacle or golden syrup, but in some ways sour, and I'm trying to imagine eating an entire jug of that. Well, that's quite an absurd, but also quite a visceral and sickening comparison. And he delivers this with an imperative to the reader, offering them the chance to consider what would happen if they tried to do this. Throughout the text, Hemingway is using personal nouns. He is labelling his subjects very effectively to convey his attitude or to convey his criticism of them. If the noun itself doesn't convey some kind of value or attitude, then he often pre-modifies it with an adjective. So the woman is a dumpy woman. These people, the personal noun breed, which is equally an animalistic one, but they are a strange looking breed, so we get the compound adjective pre-modifying the personal noun breed. They are loafers, pleasure seekers, bluffers, fakers, and finally someone gets caught out against a third-rate Austrian pugilist. Pugilist is a synonym for a fighter or a boxer. With regard to the grammar, Hemingway uses grammar really quite skillfully to create a sense of timing and action for what he describes. And he does this by mostly relying on present tense description, which gives his events a kind of a fresh urgency. Things are happening right now. Remember, this is journalism, and people are reading this over in Toronto, wanting to feel that this information is really up to date and current. So Hemingway is mostly using the present tense, but within the present tense, he is manipulating the aspect skillfully to create kinds of narratives. So this is a great example from his second text, The Wild Night of Music in Paris, which is very evocative in its creation of a kind of a dramatic scenario. To begin with, it uses the present perfect text. The cork has popped on the third bottle and the jazz band has brayed the American suit and cloak buyer. So this is creating a sense of actions that have happened, completed, but still in the present. He then shifts to his subject subject who begins to sway and is liable to remark. So this is now, the subject is now acting in the present, and then moves on later in this article to discuss the kind of the future of what's going to happen to this guy for the rest of his life, for the rest of the night, sorry. Moving into the future tense, you know, he will be lucky to escape with all of his money. So even within the present, and also the use of the future, we get this sense of actions that have happened within the present or actions that are ongoing within the present. So the tourist is not seeing. There's a slightly more general sense there in the use of the present continuous. So this is a really good text, this second text, to understand the way that writers can use aspect to convey a sense of time for what they describe. We've also got patterns of modality, particularly deontic modality, related, of course, to the possibility and likelihood of things happening, and he repeats the strong deontic modal must in his description of trying to drink a jug of molasses. To obviously convey the inevitability of you feeling sick after watching people in the rotonde. Hemingway is also using perspective quite thoughtfully here, and for the most part he avoids using the first person perspective. I think perhaps if he had used he does use the first person perspective on a couple of occasions towards the end of the first text, but he wants his observations to appear to have a kind of a general power. And so he avoids using the first person perspective, which would seem, I think, quite subjective and limited. Instead, he uses the third and second person, and these are operating with a kind of deictic function. So I would argue that the second person, when he says you, this is really proximal. This is closely centered along the center of experience, because it's really offering us what Hemingway can see. When he says you can turn your head and see this, or you can see this, or you can see that, really what Hemingway is offering us is his perspective, his personal observations, but offered to us in the second person. So he's really he's really offering us a kind of a shared perspective between what he sees and offering us to imagine it as we see it. The third person perspective, the he, which most often is or he or she or the woman, most often describing his perspective of his subject, these tourists, that is by comparison distal. So this is distant, whereas the second person is close. Hemingway is obviously inviting us to see this world of Paris through his eyes, and he's creating, through his use of perspective, a kind of division between the perspective that he and his reader share and the distant perspective of these fakers and bluffers. Finally then, a comment on pragmatics, which I guess could much more detail could be given to this, particularly in the way that Hemingway uses irony for humour. And remember that wherever we think that what's being conveyed is more than what is literally said, or the opposite of what is literally said, then we have irony at play. For example, he repeatedly describes the artist's artwork as a masterpiece. I don't think he really thinks it's a masterpiece. He also describes it as being like a red mince pie. So there's kind of an ironic humour here that he's conveying, where really he's saying that he means the opposite of what he says. We also have that dramatic dialogue between the muggers, which would be a really good example for a pragmatic analysis. It's very rich in irony. They both describe, I think, they both laugh at the fact that the hotel or the bar has mugged the tourist worse than they have, and that's actually quite a funny, witty observation. That dialogue there, really, Hemingway is inviting us to share in the joke with the two muggers, and of course the subject of the joke is the tourist, which is really quite an unsympathetic way to portray someone who's been mugged, but, well, Hemingway. Okay, that's a fairly solid overview of the linguistic features, but remember, you need to sound highly convincing, you need to be highly accurate, and you need to be using advanced terms and looking at advanced aspects of language to really get yourself to the top of the grade scheme. When we think about the connections that this text could make, A number of really useful connections present themselves. There's a sub-representation of crime within the text, which would compare well with discourses about pickpocketing, for example, in Mike and Sophia or in the Gransnet text. The expatriate lifestyle is the central focus. It's also a central focus in Another American, Breathless and Understanding Chic. It's interesting to think what Hemingway would have made of those others, those other expatriates who, really like him, have gone to Paris because of its attractive culture. The text is similar, I think, to Bill Bryson's text because it is equally satirical and it's using kind of caricature to create humour. But that's also true, perhaps, of less literary texts, such as Isabel's recollection of the characters in the Parc Monceau, or Cox's graveside observations in 80 Dates. This is the people-watching sub-representation, if you like. Finally, Williams's Letters from France is a compelling picture of Paris from another really important moment, I guess, in Parisian culture, or an important stage in Paris historically. And it has a similarity to Hemingway's text in that it's kind of journalistic, in that it's an example of a reportage. It's reporting the events that are happening in Paris at that given moment. That is 15 minutes, which is a triple what it says on the label. But hey, I guess you're lucky in that there's plenty to say about this text. And if it were to be a printed text in an exam, it would be one whose features really offer you a chance to analyse in great detail. So I hope you found that useful. Don't forget to subscribe or check the series because, of course, there are many other videos in this series. Most of the texts are up already. If you've got any requests or any questions, just post them in the comments below. Cheers. Bye.